Greetings, my excellent friends. It's Josh Cripps here, and I just got back from one of the most visually spectacular countries I have ever been to, and that is Pakistan. So Pakistan's been on my radar as a travel destination for the last 8 or 9 years, ever since my friend Yulia went there, and she was regaling me with all of these great stories about how friendly the people were and how wonderful the food was, and of course, how utterly gobsmacking the scenery was. And she started showing me pictures of the landscapes of the places that she went, and my jaw really was on the floor. And so it's been bouncing around inside my brain ever since then. But it wasn't until last summer, the summer of 2024, when I was hiking in the backcountry with my good buddy Farooq, whose family is originally from Pakistan, that the idea for a trip finally started to crystallize. So he was regaling me as well with stories about what a great place it is to travel. And I said, you know what? Let's do it, man. Let's forget someday. Let's make someday today. Let's plan a trip. And so a couple weeks later, he actually sent me a text and he said, hey, look, I'm thinking about doing a motorcycle trip through Pakistan. Do you want to come? I said, actually, that sounds incredible, except for one tiny little thing. I don't know how to ride a motorcycle. And this is a whole little story, but suffice it to say that a crash course in learning how to ride a bike ensued. And so then in April of 2025, Farooq and I and my buddy Eric, we all flew out to Pakistan to ride motorcycles through the mountains of the north for 2 weeks. The trip started in Islamabad, where we picked up our bikes and we met the guys who were going to be guiding us through the mountains, and we set off for the north. And the first couple of days were just getting used to riding around in Pakistan. They drive on the other side of the road, as we do here in the US. The traffic is a little bit more chaotic, let's say, and just kind of getting a sense, getting a feel for the roads, getting a sense for what it's like to really ride a bike through a foreign country. And the first couple of days were pretty warm, and we did have some lovely scenery, some big, deep valleys and wonderful forests and things like that. But on the third day, that's when things really started to get incredible. We entered the area of Gilgit Baltistan. And although I knew that the mountains were going to be incredible, I really didn't know what to expect. Now, later we learned that Pakistan has more than 4,500 mountains that are taller than 19,500 feet. It's really hard to digest what that means and just how big those mountains are until you show up in a place like Gilgit Baltistan, and everywhere you look, there's a 20,000 foot tall mountain. Now, I live in a really spectacular place here in the United States in the Eastern Sierra, and from where I live, the mountains rise over 10,000 feet from the valley floor to the highest points of their summits. And that's really incredible, but it's pretty small scale compared to what you find in Pakistan. So just to give you an example, on our third day of riding, as we neared this little village called Minipin, a mountain called Rakaposhi came into view. And the village of Minipin, it sits at about 6,600 feet in altitude. Well, the top of Rakaposhi, which rises straight from Minipin, there aren't any foothills, there aren't any other smaller mountains in the way, it just goes straight up from Minipin to the top of Rakaposhi. Well, the summit of that mountain is 25,500 feet. So you're talking about basically 18, almost 19,000 feet of elevation change from the base to the top. It's one of the largest unbroken walls in the world. And in fact, the name Rakaposhi has been translated to mean the shining wall. And when you see this absolute huge blade of snow and ice and glaciers erupting up out of the ground, it seems like the most appropriate name that I could imagine for the mountain. So because this was specifically a motorcycle trip with friends, it was not a dedicated photography trip, we really spent most of our time riding the bikes, having dinner with the group, enjoying the travel experience of being in Pakistan. And for me, it was less about photography, but that doesn't mean I didn't have a few opportunities here and there to break out the camera, to break out the drone, and get a few shots. And so that's what I want to tell you about in this video, is my experience of photographing in the northern part of Pakistan. And in this particular video, I really want to get into my experiences of shooting in a place called the Hunza Valley. The Hunza Valley follows the Hunza River, as you might expect, from the junction of the Indus River all the way up through the Karakoram Mountains, basically to the border with China. Now, we didn't go that far. The area where we spent all our time was basically centered between the small village of Minapin, the larger town of Karimabad, and the small village of Gulmit, which is near an area called Pasu. I honestly could have stayed there for weeks, exploring all the little side valleys and just shooting even from the road, because as we drove along, Rakaposhi was not the only massive mountain that we saw. Everywhere you looked, everywhere you turned, there was some 20,000, 21 or 22,000 foot peak. It was absolutely insane. In fact, my buddies and I, we would sit there and go, okay, the tallest mountain in California, Mount Whitney, that goes up to, we're about right there on that mountain. For example, there was this place we got to called Pasu, and above it is this thing called the Pasu Cones, but the name of the mountain is called Tupapdan, and it's 20,033 feet tall, and we were looking at it going, oh, Mount Whitney would just be one of these tiny little crags going halfway up the mountain. I mean, the relief of these peaks was really spectacular, really sensational. So I want to start showing you some of the photos that I took on this particular trip from Minapin to Gulmit, because we really passed a lot of spectacular scenery. And one of the coolest things that we went past was this place called Ottabad Lake. And this was a lake that was formed not very long ago, just a couple of decades ago, when there was a gigantic landslide that fell down and it choked the canyon and it blocked the Hunza River and it started to back up. And what it backed up with was all of the runoff from all of these huge glaciers up there in the Karakoram Mountains. So if you've ever been to anywhere with glacial lakes like New Zealand or Canada, you know that the water is quite milky because it's full of all this fine silt. And when the sunlight strikes that water, it turns the most surreal color of turquoise. And as we rounded the lake, there's a series of tunnels now that carve through the mountains. Some of these tunnels are miles long to get around this gigantic landslide carving straight through the mountain. There's one point where you pop out and you have an unbelievable view to the left and to the right, up and down this massive lake. And the sun was just coming in, kissing the edge of the mountain, creating this line of light and shadow across the lake, creating these two very distinct shades of blue that were just stunning to witness. And so I grabbed my camera off the bike, I zoomed in on that. I wanted to get a really nice tight shot showing the contrast not only of the different colors of light on the water, but also the contrast with the steep sheer walls of the valley. So you have these warm and cool tones, creating these cool diagonals just flowing through the frame like this. But that was just a pit stop. We continued on through the tunnels and on into the town of Gulmit, the little village there. And as we did, those Pasu cones that I mentioned earlier really started to come into sight. Now, we got there late in the day. It was super late afternoon. It was almost sunset. So as soon as we arrived at our guest house, I dropped all my luggage off. I jumped back on the bike. I grabbed my camera gear and my drone, and I drove down back through town. I rode down back through town to the edge of the river. Although it was howling windy, so it wasn't really practical to set up the tripod, nor were there really any nice foregrounds for me to explore too much with my mirrorless camera. Really what I was focused in on was the light kissing the corrugations of the Pasu cone. So as the sun was setting into the west, it was coming in at this wonderful glancing angle, really creating all of this depth and dimension in the mountains. So I zoomed into about 170 millimeters, really just to fill the frame with that incredible mountain, Tupapdan, or the Pasu cones. As you can see, that beautiful light cascading across all of those triangular jagged features of the rock. So anybody who's ever photographed something very tall, like a giant mountain or even a tree like a redwood or a sequoia tree, you know that it's very difficult to portray their sense of scale when you are photographing them from the bottom of the tree or the bottom of the mountain. And that was the case in Pakistan as well. We would be witnessing these 20,000 or 22,000 foot mountains, but we would only be at an elevation of maybe 6,000 or 7,000 feet. And so I'd be pointing my camera up like this, and it would absolutely just cause all of this foreshortening, and it would make the top of the mountain look quite minuscule, not quite as impressive as it was standing there in person. So the way that I found to get around this in Pakistan was to fly the drone. And it's really cool because So anyway, so then I was flying my drone out over the river at a place where I could really get a good sense of scale of these mountains. And on this particular night, I love just flying up and down the Hunza River there, trying to get different perspectives of the Pasu cones of that beautiful mountain, Ottabad. And as I flew along the river, I found this one spot where the two edges of the riverbanks came together in these wonderful lines and these bifurcations that are so common in these glacial river valleys. And it created these wonderful lines that led in from the corner of the frame and up to the wonderful, brilliant red and yellow and warm tones of that setting sun on the Pasu cones. On this one, I really wanted to create that broad sense of scale that you get from a telephoto. So I used that. It's got a 70mm equivalent, and that photo looks something like this. And you can see the wide angle, although it is very cool, it's very impressive to get that sweeping sense of the valley. It does make the mountains in the background look quite a bit smaller. So in the end, I really preferred that telephoto shot just for that sense of scale and how it really allowed me to simply fill the frame with what I wanted, which was the glacial river snaking off into the distance and then that massive mountain looming there in the background with that stunning, gorgeous, warm light on it. All in all, we spent about 2 days in the Gilgit Pasu area. We arrived that first evening where those photos that I just showed you. And then we spent the next day really exploring the area. We got to do a lot of cool stuff. There are a ton of glaciers in the area. I mean, there are 2 glaciers literally right outside the town. One is called the White Glacier, one is called the Black Glacier, and there's the Pasu Glacier, there's the Batura Glacier. There's so many freaking glaciers. It's really ridiculous. In fact, Pakistan has the most glaciers of any place in the world outside the polar region. And when you get up to these zones, you really see the effect of that glaciation on the landscape with just how sheer and steep the valley walls are. And so we actually got to spend some time exploring one of those glaciers, the Pasu Glacier, a little bit. We basically rode our bikes up this rickety old dirt road to a parking lot where we then walked about another 20-25 minutes up a pretty cool precipitous path to a viewpoint overlooking the glacier. And this viewpoint was about as sketchy as it gets. It was right on the edge of the lateral moraine of the glacier. And the glacier had obviously receded a little bit, and where it had withdrawn, it left behind this crumbling wall of rock. And the viewpoint was just right on top of this crumbling wall, and it went straight down. And actually, while we were standing there, we would hear rocks falling. They would just tumble down as the moraine was starting to erode. I mean, it was just ridiculous like how if you took 2 or 3 steps forward and you caused something to collapse, you just go right down there. But the view out over this valley of the Pasu Glacier really was sensational. Now, the glacier itself, I thought was quite fascinating because unlike a lot of the glaciers that I have seen, it wasn't blue. Even when the sunlight hit it, it was almost a featureless white. And even the photos that I took in color look black and white. This was another zone where I was able to put the drone to good use because from the viewpoint, you could see some of the glacier, but not really enough of it really to make an interesting photograph. But with the drone, I was able to get up right in the fins and domes and ridges of the glacier to really bring out a lot of their textures and the interesting patterns and lines and shape. We had kind of stormy weather that particular day, so the top of the glacier was just in the clouds and in the fog. You couldn't really see it. You couldn't see the high mountains. So there wasn't, unfortunately, some sort of gigantic, big, sweeping vista up to a massive glaciated mountain in the background, but there were a lot of really interesting patterns within the glacier itself. So I decided to focus on that with my drone, and for the first one, I basically got right above it, right above all of these cool parallel cracks in the glacier. And when I'm not sure what I want to shoot, I'll just start with an idea, just start with something, just start shooting. And I find that that process really helps get my brain going, get my creativity going, and then I start to see all kinds of different stuff. So I started with this particular photo, and then I just decided to get down closer to the glacier and shoot it a little bit more in depth from various angles. And at one point I actually flew the drone right up in between a couple of fins of rock so I could really get a sense of that bird's eye view on the level with the glacier. It was really cool. You know, as the drone was flying, I also noticed out across the valley was this incredibly pointy, spiky mountain that had all of this beautiful dappled light on it. And that particular scene, for me, it wasn't something that was calling to me in a grandiose sense of, look how spectacular this area is. Of course, the peak, it's quite dramatic, it's quite pointy, and it had this beautiful light on it, but it was more just the exploration of the ideas, enjoying the process of being a photographer, looking at that beautiful dappled light and how it danced across the landscape. So I brought the drone down and I grabbed out my long lens, and again, I just zoomed in, just trying to fill the frame with that idea of the dappled light on this particular pointy cone. And that was just a fun thing to explore for a couple of minutes. One thing that I also want to mention about this trip is that we were there in springtime, and the valleys that we were in were very lush, quite contrasty to the extreme high glaciated mountains. In contrast to those crumbling valley walls that have been carved out by those glaciers, the valley floors were extremely lush and green, thanks to the villagers doing irrigation and doing all kinds of planting of various crops. And one of the most beautiful things that we saw while we were there was the fruit trees. So there were apricot, apple, and cherry trees in bloom throughout these valleys. I mean, I was really in disbelief just how the contrast between these high, rugged mountains and the wonderful greens, the lush sense of life and rebirth and renewal that was happening down in the valley. It was really spectacular, and it made a wonderful contrast that I wanted to explore in my photographs as well. Now, luckily, on our last morning there in Gilgit, we woke up to all kinds of beautiful atmospherics. There were these stunning crepuscular rays shooting across the mountains as the sun came up over the ridges. There were low clouds inverted below the peaks, making the mountains seem like they're rising up, you know, into the heavens. And then, of course, you had all of the wonderful poplar trees and fruit trees down there in the valley. So I was able to literally, just from the porch of the guest house where we were staying, I was able to launch the drone, fly it up and down the valley, capture a little bit of that, as well as just shoot with my long lens again from that particular vantage point and capture the wonderful contrast between those stunning mountains and the stunning green lush of the valley. So that was just 2 days that we spent there in the Hunza Valley. From there, we ended up going off to another incredible part of Pakistan called Skardu and Haplu and Shigar, and I have lots more stories and photos and video to show you from those regions, but it's gonna have to wait for the next video. So I hope you enjoyed this. I hope this has inspired you maybe to visit this spectacular part of the world, and I know I'm gonna be going back. They told me as beautiful as it was in spring, fall is even better. So right now, my plan is to go back October 2026 and really spend some time, do a dedicated photography trip, get deep into these zones, and really see what the country of Pakistan has to offer in terms of that photography. Anyway, I got lots more, like I said, to show you in the upcoming videos, so stay tuned. Until then, have fun and happy shooting.